Okay, well, welcome. Thank you so much. I am glad to be here. A little bit about me. I am a former middle school teacher. I'm a current college professor, and I'm passionate about seeing teachers transform their spaces, their classrooms into bastions of creativity and wonder. And I genuinely believe that teachers have done a phenomenal job this year proving that social distance hasn't had to mean relational distance. And I recognize that it has been a tough year, that we are all experimenting, iterating, finding new ways to do this. And so that's what I want to talk about. What I would love for you to do is, if in the chat you would share, what are some of the challenges that you see with group collaboration? So when you think about the challenges that you face, the things that you've seen, what have been the big challenges? And again, that in the chat, if you'd be willing to do that. Yeah, internet capability definitely has been a challenge. Where I am, I'm just seeing that I've seen a huge difference in just spaces. There's been a definite at the university, a rural and urban divide in just the type of internet speed that people have. Students unable to stay on task and focus, definitely. That's been an issue. Anybody else want to share? That made me laugh. Yes. Not participating as expected, others doing too much of the work. Yeah, and that happens, online, that happens in person. Some of the big expectations, accountability, loving what people are sharing here. Yeah. So with that in mind, I just want to share a few ideas, but I want to recognize from the outset that there is no secret formula here, that there is no guarantee to make collaboration work perfectly and effectively every single time. And it's because the reality is there will always be moments when it fails. Um, and we have an imperfect world with imperfect students. When I think about the best collaboration I've ever done with colleagues or with friends or work projects, there were times when our collaboration broke down. There were times when we argued. There were times when we disagreed. There were moments where one person was doing too much of the work. And if that's true of adults, if that's true of highly functioning teams, that's going to be true of the students that we work with as well. It will never be perfect, and collaboration will always be inherently messy. I love this meme that showed up a couple years ago, and for me, this is how I often felt when I was a student. I hated the word group project. I guess that's not a word. The two words group project, because I knew that there'd be 99% who do all of the work, one person who has no idea what's going on, one person who says he's going to help but doesn't, one person who hears. And when this is going to age me a little bit, we would have a group project and the teacher would put this transparency projector up, right? It was this weird looking thing where you wrote on the thing and the light popped up and it would it would hurt your eyes if you ever looked down at it, and then it would project up onto the screen. If you're significantly younger than me, you might not remember or have ever seen that, but it was a thing. And I remember times where they would put up on the transparency projector names of all of the students who were in the different groups. And my heart would instantly sink because I knew who I had in my group. I knew, for example, that I had the drifter. The drifter was the student who was going to wander from place to place to place in the classroom, constantly forth and not engaging in the project at all. That would be the person that, according to this meme, disappears at the beginning and doesn't show up to the end. So the drifter. There was the helpless hand raiser, the person who would raise their hand constantly and just ask questions, and we couldn't get through any step in an assignment or a project until they knew that we were doing it the absolute right way. There was the feisty fighter who would stir up drama in the group and try to, do all the work for them. And I was thinking about that and the students that I had. Oh, we don't see your screen? That's so weird. All right, I'm gonna try this again. Tell me if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen right now?
Now we can see your screen.
Cool. Can you see it when I go into play mode? Yes or no?
No.
Crappity crap bag. Okay, I will keep it this way then. That's all right. Sorry about that. Well, there we go. There was a meme that you missed that was there. And for the people, 99% do all the work. One person has no idea what's going on. One person says he's going to help, but he's not. One person disappears. So what I was saying is that we had, and right now, are you able to see my screen? Just yes or no? I can see the chat on the side. Yes, cool. All right, I'm going to keep it this way then. So as I thought about this, and I thought about the different students that we had, I was talking to my wife about it, and I said, I hated being in that group because I felt like I was the only one doing all of the work, right? How many of us felt that way when we were students? Group work was, you would see your heart would sink, and immediately you knew you're going to do twice the amount of work as anyone else. But then she said something that reminded me of this other reality. She said, well, you might have had the drifter or the feisty fighter, but do you know who you were? And I said, no. She said, you were the control freak. You were the person who had to have your way probably in a group, or you were the one who would just get the work done anyway and wouldn't wait for other people. And because of that, that sometimes was why other students weren't getting the work done. Moment where I thought, oh man, busted. And I said, how did you know that? And she said, because I was the control freak too. That's who we were as students. We struggled with collaboration because we didn't know how to listen. We didn't know how to work with students who were struggling. We didn't know how to work interdependently. Other times that I was in the group where I would have said I was the quiet one. I was the one who sat back on the side, and I did the bare amount of work. I didn't step forward as a leader, but I would just give me my specific job and I will do it, but then I'm not going to do any more or any less than I absolutely have to do. And in that moment, I would have described myself as like sort of the consumer. I was treating group work like an exchange where I'm going to do only what I absolutely have to do and not any more and not any less, but also partly because those were often the moments where I was a little bit scared and insecure. I would love for you in the chat to mention what are some of the other things that you've seen. So you've seen the drifter, the helpless hand raiser, the feisty fighter. Who else might you have seen as a student when you move into group work? What are some other roles that kids sometimes step into? The quiet one that does not like to speak with others? Yeah. That's only part of it. Any other ones? The popular kids. Yes, I didn't even think about that. The class clown who goofs off and gets everyone else off task. Sort of the joker in the group, right? And so if they're doing a small group task of 4 students, if you've got the joker in it, sometimes that will prevent the group from getting things done because they're busy making jokes and having fun and goofing off. So all of these things exist. The thoughts that I had was that when it comes down to this, some of what happens, and I know I stopped sharing for a moment because there's no slide to share in this particular moment, but one of the thoughts that I have is that part of why students end up in these different roles is that there's always an underlying cause of it. So if you think about this for just a moment, if we have the drifter, and we think about the drift, what would cause the drifter to be walking around the class nonstop? What are some potential causes of that? Just share in the chat. I'd love to see your thoughts. So what might be motivating the drifter to be distracting others? Yeah, a lack of interest in the task. Sometimes getting out of work. In cognitive psychology, they have a term for it, cognitive loading, and it's the idea of allowing other people to do the thinking and the work for you. I love this. The drifter may be restless and try to pay attention by moving. Yeah, sometimes people just need to move, and it's a sign to me to say, oh, in this particular task, I need to get students up and moving around. You know, stand up, hand up, pair up, and use some of those cooperative to actually incorporate movement. Sometimes it's, I love this, Chris does not understand the task. Sometimes you're drifting because you're avoiding the work because it's too hard and it's confusing and you're confused. Now, the helpless hand raiser was a student who always was hard for me because they're constantly raising their hand and saying, are we doing it right? Is it going? What might be causing that constantly stopping the work by raising their hand and asking questions? What might be the motivating factor? And one of my thoughts is often this is someone who has experienced learned helplessness, right? So that could be one of the causes, learned helplessness. Fearful of getting it wrong. Absolutely. And I think about the feisty fighter, the one who seems to be stirring up drama within a group or causing conflict. What might this person be motivated by? And as I think about this, you know, one of my thoughts with the feisty fighter is sometimes they don't even know that they're being feisty. You know, I've seen some students who are pretty feisty and they seem to be causing a lot of conflict, but actually they don't see it as conflict. They see it as they're having fun fighting. They're arguing about what to do on a project. They love the way conflict creates solutions, and they love debating and discussing. And what they see as conflict, or what they see is just discussing how to do something in a group. Others might see as conflict. Others might see as, you know, creating drama or problems within a group. And so all of this to say, you know, a lot of what students experience, a lot of who they are within a group is dynamic, it's complicated, and there's a lot of motives that go into that. You know, even something like, you know, you might have the feisty fighter, but then you have another peacekeeper. And the peacekeeper in that moment, their goal is to resolve conflict and to get students to get along and to create group unity. And that all seems like a great motivating factor. But I have seen peacemakers who stop their group from necessary conflict and who sometimes stop voices of dissent from happening in the name of group unity, and they don't realize that they're doing that. And I've seen that at times even with colleagues, with collaborative groups, you know, teams and departments. So all of this to say it's very complicated. And if this is a reality, and we see this with our students, it is tempting then to, I'm just not going to have students engage in collaboration. In fact, I saw a lot of teachers who realized how hard collaboration was and how challenging these moments were, who, when it came to virtual learning this year, they said, we're not even going to do it. I can't see if students are discussing questions in their breakout rooms. It's too hard for me to monitor. There are too many students who just disengage. And so I'm going to full-blown direct instruction, right? And the reality, though, is if we don't develop collaboration, there's a real cost. So I want us to talk for just a moment about why collaboration matters. And then we're going to get into those factors that we can use as we design collaborative assignments and projects and structures. So Project Oxygen was a project by this little tech company called Google. You might have heard of them. And they wanted to figure out what allows or what factors lead to being successful in their company. And their hypothesis was that it would be your degree. What, students who came from better schools would become employees who would be more successful. That was the running theory. The reality is they were not even able to find a weak correlation between degree program and success. Now, pool is a little bit biased because in general, they are hiring students who are good students from any university, regardless of the university. So whether you are coming from, MIT or coming from Arizona State, they're hiring top students, period. So I want to point out the weak correlation doesn't mean that degree programs don't matter or anything. It's just saying that all things considered, it didn't play a significant role in success at Google. Instead, this is what they found. The most important factors were being a good coach and also being coachable, right? So being able to help others, but being able to listen to and follow advice. Communicating and listening was important. Passing insights into others, including others' different values and points of view, having empathy toward and being supportive of one's colleagues. Those were the most significant factors. Now, I look at this list and I think this is being a good collaborator, right? If you're a good collaborator, you're a coach, you communicate and listen well, you possess insights into others, you can pay attention to their point of view, you have empathy, you're a supportive colleague. That's being good at collaboration. And I would argue that when those factors are there, collaboration is better, but also when you engage in meaningful collaboration, you develop these soft skills. And to be honest, I don't like the term soft skills because there is nothing soft about it. As a teacher, I have found that developing soft skills is far harder than teaching students how to identify a linear equation by looking at a graph, right? It is way easier for me to teach that, some of those discrete skills, than those soft skills. But then as they looked at this and they realized, being a collaborator is significant, let's look at teams. So they studied teams in Project Aristotle. And in Project Aristotle, what they found is that the most successful teams demonstrated equality, generosity, curiosity toward the ideas of your teammates, right? You're openly curious about what they're thinking. Empathy, which was one of the factors on the first study as well, and emotional intelligence. So these were those critical soft skills. This was that whole idea of learning how to be a great collaborator. Now, what I would love for you to share is, what do you think are some of the results of being a good collaborator? So if we think of, this is what Google said about soft skills, but when students become great at collaboration, just list what are some of the soft skills that they develop? What are some of those reasons we would want them to be good at collaboration? And just share it in the chat. Yeah, it gives them confidence. Thanks, Harmony. Any other ideas? Life skills for future employment, not a soft skill, but the work is stronger. Yes, absolutely. One of the goals is to create something together as a group that would be better than what you could do individually. Any other ideas? What would be the benefit of it? What are some of those skills that they gain? Like one of the things I thought about is when I have seen students engage in meaningful collaboration and really do it well, they become divergent thinkers, which didn't show up at all in Google's survey, but I have found that to be true. That there is something really valuable in the ability to think divergently that happens when you are working collaboratively with diverse perspectives. And you just can't gain that working independently. You have to work collaboratively to get there. Any other ideas? And then we're going to shift gears a little bit into this idea right here of the critical factors of collaboration. So I want to share 4 different critical factors in terms of meaningful collaborative projects. And the way I'm going to define collaboration is the action of combining knowledge, skills, and resources to achieve a common goal. So that's how I'm defining collaboration here. So 4 factors of successful collaboration. Number 1 is student ownership. So if we think about this continuum, we have student agency. So how much ownership they have in their learning, how much voice and choice they have in their learning. And on the left-hand side, it's more teacher-centered. On the right-hand side, it's more learner-centered. And so we begin with compliance. Compliance is I'm doing this because I have to do this. It's a requirement of me. There's nothing wrong with compliance. It sometimes gets a bad rap, but there are times when you want compliance. For example, in classroom rules, I've always, whether I taught middle school or now at the university level, I've always been pretty strict about not talking when a student is talking to a whole group. As a respect thing, if one person is addressing the whole group, everyone listens. That's a compliance issue. I need you to follow that rule. Compliance is important for something like a fire drill. If there's a fire drill, that is not the time to pull a Fleetwood Mac and go your own way, right? You need compliance. But then you have engagement, and engagement takes it to the next level where it says, I'm doing this not just because I have to, that yes, it might be required of me, but I'm also doing it because I want to do this. I love how Philip Schlechte defined engagement in Schlechte's levels of engagement as being fully committed to the task and being fully focused on the task. And a lot of what we saw this year, a lot of the struggles that teachers experienced were around student engagement. When it was virtual and students were working at home, it was a real challenge to get students to be engaged. Their focus level was lower because there were a ton of distractions all around. And it was hard to get them to focus when there's TikTok videos to look at, or a PlayStation, or an Xbox just vying for your attention. So staying focused alone was a challenge, and staying committed became a challenge because you couldn't, necessarily have the same classroom community that you had before. But empowerment takes it to the next level, and empowerment is built on student buy-in and ownership. So being engaged, there's some level of buy-in, but being empowered is where you have actual voice and choice in your learning. So this might be engaging in a self-assessment as a student. This might be asking your own questions as a student. This might be having a choice in the topics that you're doing a choice menu, having multiple options. It could involve setting your own goals and monitoring your progress. And so it's this idea of ownership. And that's where that empowerment part comes in. And it takes it to that next level. And one of the things I'll say is this: the students who struggled the most with virtual learning this year were not necessarily students who were low achievers. Some of them were, but they tended to be the students who had the least amount of self-direction. And self-direction, a self-starter and a self-manager. It's the notion of getting, to work, being a self-starter, taking initiative, but also being a self-manager where you are monitoring your progress, you're keeping up, you're checking to see how you're doing, and you're getting the work done. And what we saw with virtual learning is because we can't monitor students in the same way as you typically could, there was a challenge with students being self-starters and being self-managers. And the students who struggled the most were the ones who struggled with getting started and managing their learning. They were the ones who didn't have that self-direction. And I've talked to a lot of different teachers who said, look, I had some straight A students who suddenly really low grades and not logging into class and not turning their cameras on and not turning assignments in. Necessarily an issue of student engagement. That's an issue of a student who's not empowered. They don't own the learning. And again, this isn't necessarily the fault of teachers. I want to point that out. When I was a kid, issue of sort of the emergence of helicopter parents. So I'm a child of the 80s. You started seeing the helicopter parents emerge who would hover and make sure that kids were getting things done. And in those moments, they were probably preventing students from being self-managers, from really owning it themselves, because they were interfering on accident with the best of intentions. And now we have snowplow parents. Snowplow parents, look at all of the challenges that their kids are going to face, plow the snow for them to make the easiest path possible for them. Well, being a snowplow parent will prevent kids from being self-directed. It prevents them from being self-starters and self-managers. So again, this doesn't necessarily come from school. It's part of culture and society, but it is a very, I don't know if anyone else here has experienced this, but there have been times where parents asked for extra time and deadlines and things like that in ways that have prevented students from actually getting work done and from being self-directed. And again, it's done with the best of intentions on the parents' part, but it's a very real challenge. So again, it's not necessarily coming from school. Sometimes it comes from culture and society. But the reality is, if we want teams to function well, they have to have self-direction as a team as well. So they have to be self-starters and self-managers, and we can build in ownership and buy-in by empowering them to own more of the collaborative process. I'm going to give a small example. When I did collaborative projects with students, my very first year of doing PBL, I managed all of the projects. And what I found myself doing is I had 180 students and they were in teams of 4. And that was just way too many projects for me to manage. And it became overwhelming for me to see who's on track, who's not on track, how's it going, what, who's missing their deadlines. And what I began to do is shift from being a teacher to being a nag. I was constantly walking around and checking to see if people got it done, if they got their work done, if they were on task, if they weren't on task. And I actually didn't enjoy the collaborative projects in these because I was so focused on being a project manager for way too many projects. But then I realized my students didn't own the project management process. So if we think about management, they weren't setting the goals or charting the progress. They weren't breaking down tasks and setting deadlines. They weren't choosing strategies. They weren't monitoring, adjusting, and problem solving. And so I realized I need to teach students how to own the project management process. And that would help them develop into self-starters and self-managers. So they would own this process. Part of it was of their projects. So finding the product idea, the audience, the role, the tasks, and the solution. Another part of it was using specific tools and technology to help them with the project management process itself. So for example, I taught students how to use Trello, and many groups chose Trello as a way to monitor their project. And what I found to be really effective was to assign one member of the group, or group choose one member who would be the project manager. And this job was to keep the group on task rather than me being the project manager. And so they ran the Trello board together with their group. And then what I could do is I could have a meeting with all 6 project managers from the different groups while the students were working independently on their projects, and just ask for a quick project update from the project manager. Or I would have the project manager meet with me and the teams in these little 3 to 4 minute meetings. And now the onus was on them to tell me how they were doing in terms of their project progress, rather than me going to them, telling them you're ahead of schedule, you're behind schedule, here's why, here's how to fix it. And now I was more of a consultant rather than a nag. I was helping them when they needed it, but they were helping themselves a lot more. Sometimes it's something like a project management log, or another version of this is a spreadsheet. So this is a snapshot from an 8th grade project that I did with students, and they were experts for an interview. Or sorry, they were interviewing experts for a documentary project. And as you can see, schedule the interview, filming, editing, adding. There's tasks, subtasks, the member responsible, a deadline, and the progress. And in many cases, they would take the progress and color. Green is you have plenty of time. Yellow is you're running out of time. Red is late, and then blue would be you're done. Something like a check-in form. This is the idea of having students do a Google form with their project, and in showing you their progress, and then you get all of this data on the Google Forms. So that's one area of ownership. Another area would be having students decide the different group roles. So who's going to do what within a group, specific group responsibilities. I would love for you to share, what are some group roles that you have found to be helpful when having students engage in collaborative projects? So I gave the example of a project manager, but what are some other roles that you've found to be successful? Yeah, researcher, having one person volunteer to be the typer. Yeah, like the reporter for the group. A designer role, I love that, in charge of the presentation. You know, I gave the example of the feisty fighter is sometimes the critic, and so one of the things I ask someone to do is to be the critic and to learn how to give critical feedback to the group, both negative and positive. And that was one of my favorite roles that I did with graduate students in real life. Control and testing, I love that. And what I love about roles is that they can be for a whole project, or they can be for a day, right? So you can students roles that they have within a small group, but you can have them self-select the roles. You can have them come up with the roles on their own. Timekeeper is huge. I got to tell you, in my university courses, I have a timekeeper within class in general, just to keep me on task. to say, hey, you're running behind schedule, here's the agenda. And they just send me a private message that says, hey, you're running behind. If we're in person, they just do a point to their watch and let me know, hey, you're running behind. I found that to be really helpful. All right, I'm gonna move on, but I love the ideas. And so I'm gonna move now to factor number 2, which is interdependence. And if we think about it this way, interdependence is this overlap between independent learning and dependent learning. So often in schools, students will do independent learning. They're gonna work by themselves. They're gonna finish various tasks on their own. They do individual assignments. And that's a good thing. We want independent learning. We want students to develop into independent thinkers. But we also want them to learn how to depend on each other. Unfortunately, if it's all dependent in a group, then you have this thing where one person is doing all of the work, they're working independently, everyone else is depending on them. The sweet spot is that place of interdependence where people are working independently, but they're also depending on each other to complete the task. So it's the idea that you're gonna do something you cannot do on your own. Together as a group, you're going to accomplish something bigger than yourselves. So you get a chance to process information individually, but you also have to depend on others. You're providing for your group and your group is providing for you. And it's this constant interplay between you depending on them and your group depending on you. It's the notion that each member has a voice, that you share ideas forth, but also that you're listening. We can build interdependence into our lessons. So I'm going to give a short example of one from a younger grade. So this was when I was an instructor. I did this first with early elementary students. I guess they were not too early. They were third graders. And they were going to engage in research for a design thinking project. Now, this worked so well with them that I then implemented it with my middle schoolers. So it starts with jotting down a list of any questions you have about blank, and then rotating clockwise, they each share their questions. Now, this first step could be done as a Google form, and the group would get a whole spreadsheet full of questions if they want. In this case, we use chart paper or actually butcher paper. But then each member of the group has a role and they have to work interdependently. So they're each responsible for one part of this task of analyzing the research questions in order to figure out if they are good research questions. So going back to this, each person has a voice. There's that individual accountability built into it, but then they're gonna work interdependently and depend on each other. Ones are good research questions. So what I did with this was each member had a different colored marker and they put a check mark or a star. And so they put a blue star by every one for is it specific? Someone else has purple or green for fact-based. For on topic, it might be red. And once something has 3 stars, the group says, yes, that is a good research question. And what I love about it is the student who struggles a little bit, who might be the helpless hand raiser or the drifter wandering around, they still have a job. Their group needs, and they can tell the difference between a question that is on topic or not. They still have a role, even if their skill level is a little bit lower. Now, the member who dominates in a group, who might do all the work for them, their job is to be member number 4, quality control. And what I love about the quality control person is their job is to help the other members only when asked. So they learn how to listen. So if someone is like, I'm not really sure if this is fact-based, can you help me with this? Then they get to step in and help. Or if they think someone might have gotten it wrong, there's a series of clarifying questions they can ask to guide the other students. And so they're learning how to work interdependently in this moment. Factor number 3 is structure. If you look at this, you notice there's structure built into this. in doing collaborative projects, the very first time where, and I actually, my entire first year of doing PB, I would give students a task and a project, but then I would just give them directions as a group, and there was no structure to it. And so that allowed one member to do all the work. And so the goal then is that you provide structures that help facilitate the creative thinking. One example would be you might have to give structures for language supports. If they struggle with academic language, you can give them sentence stems, like these sentence stems. You can front load vocabulary for them and give them access to that. You can give them anchor charts and tutorials that they can use. And all of that would be an example of providing structure for a group. The projects themselves can have structure. So notice this inquiry process that a group might do in an inquiry-based experiment or an inquiry-based project. You start with a provocation. They engage in research, analyze data, share insights. That leads to more, that provokes deeper insights and questions. It becomes a cycle. Well, this inquiry process structure. So not only could be the structures be things that you use within a class period, but it could also be the structure you use for the larger project where you're breaking it into phases. Another example would be the design thinking process. And notice that with all of these, there's student ownership. So the launch process, they're asking their own questions. They're engaging in their own research. They're navigating ideas and generating their own ideas, their own original ideas. They're creating prototypes and they're prototyping together as a group. They are owning the assessment process of what's working, what's failing as they analyze their work and highlight and fix, iterate, and then they're choosing the audience. So there's ownership built into it. And that's why ideas are all interconnected. But even when this happens, it can still be a struggle, right? You could have student ownership. You could be doing cooperative learning strategies that are built on interdependence. You can have everything working, and a group still has struggles. Some groups might not get things done. Some groups, even when you give the tutorials, they're struggling. But some groups, there might be conflict. They might have a few kids who are lacking and not getting any work done, that type of stuff. And often it's a result of a lack of trust within a group. And so the fourth factor is increasing trust within a group. I would love for you to share in the chat, what are some ways that you have built trust with your students? And is how have you built trust where they can trust you? But also, what are some things that you've done that helps your students build trust with one another? Just share it in the chat. What are some strategies that have worked for you in terms of building trust? Just anything that you've done that's worked for you. Love that. Personal stories that connect people to people. I love that concept. You know, one of the things that I have done with the whole class, but also with small groups, is a small get to know you time with a group. So if they're going to be working for say 3 or 4 weeks together, I'll sometimes have them do a show and tell activity where they bring in an item that represents their geeky interests, or they bring in an item that represents what they're into. And what it does is it reminds them when they get together in a group that they're working with people who are wholly human. that they're working with people who have their own interests and ideas, and it breaks the ice a little bit in a way that is trauma sensitive. So, they don't have to share their personal stories. They don't have to share their family background, anything like that. They get a lot of agency and autonomy in what they share. And I first did a show and tell activity with small groups when I taught middle school. And then I thought, oh, it's kind of childish. It doesn't really work in at the university level. But then I found it worked even better at the university level, where college students sometimes struggle with, feeling known and feeling appreciated, and you have less class time together. But doing a small show and tell activity, it was amazing what students would share. And so I actually now do, when I pull groups of students together, that'll be a homework assignment. They'll come into class and they will have a show and tell activity, and they bring in this item, and there'll always be a different prompt for it. It could be your geeky interest. It could be an item that represents who you are. It could be an item that represents something that you value. And it's amazing how deep students go with this idea of show and tell. I love this idea Carrie shared of teach students language of presenting opposing ideas without coming across as offensive or critical. Yes, that's huge, right? And one of the thoughts that I have is we will always have challenges. So one thing that can be really helpful is something like conflict resolution, teaching students how to engage in conflict resolution. Having a few students who are trained at a peer mediation process so that they can mediate the conflict that a group might have. Sometimes it's something like team agreements. It could be having students come up with group norms together. I found it works really well to have students create these agreements where they say, these are our norms as a group, or these are the agreements that we have as a group, and we're going to stick to it. My friend Trevor Muir uses a group contract, and I love this. Group members ahead of time have to share their name, their email, their contact information. They tell you ahead of time their strengths and their areas of growth. So it's asking them to be proud of who they are, but also vulnerable and humble. And then they come up with their team goals, their team agreements together, and accountability of what will happen if they are not living up to their agreements. Trust is vital when it comes to something as simple as giving and receiving feedback. So if we want to teach them about using meaningful language with feedback, it can also help to teach them about the relationship between feedback and trust. I created the following as a small grid where it's negative to positive feedback, low to high trust. And if there's positive feedback but low trust, it's flattery and it's not helpful. If there's a negative feedback and low trust, it's hating, and hating's bad, right? The haters are going to hate, 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 hate. But if there's high trust and negative feedback, it doesn't feel good, but it is critical feedback and it is vital. And if we can teach them how to give critical feedback in a way that's also kind. So I would say, like, be critically kind and kindly critical. And then if there's high trust and positive feedback, you have affirmation. There's a lot of other ways for trust building. You can have students do a rubric on how well their group is collaborating. You can have a trust, an anonymous survey that they do for how well they trust the members of their group. And it kind of gives you some data on how well group members are trusting each other and where there might be some red flags that you need to address. Now, the reality is this: there is no guaranteed perfect way to empower teams. It's always going to be hit or miss. But when we incorporate these critical factors of giving students ownership, of using structure, of building interdependence, and of increasing trust, they are more likely to have meaningful collaboration. And when that happens, they develop those critical lifelong soft skills that they'll use wherever they go in the future. So thank you so much. We are out of time. I appreciate your participation. Thanks for everyone who shared in the chat. Thank you so much.